A black woman became a billionaire by telling her pain the right way. Two black boys nearly lost everything by telling the truth the wrong way. They grew up under the same system. They survived the same silence. But one learned how to make pain profitable, and the others learned how to make truth dangerous. This is not a story about success. It's about what the world rewards, what it punishes, and what happens when the truth threatens an empire built on survival. Stay with this story, because by the end, you'll have to ask yourself whether freedom is worth the price no one warns you about. Sable Granger did not grow up believing childhood was meant to be gentle. From her earliest memory, life felt like something that pressed inward, narrowing her breath, teaching her to stay small without ever being told to. She lived in a cramped apartment where walls were thin enough to carry arguments from one room to the next and quiet enough to make silence feel dangerous. The windows rattled when trucks passed, and at night the sound of sirens folded into her dreams so completely that she stopped noticing when they were real. Fear did not arrive loudly in her life. It arrived politely, took a seat, and never left. Her guardian worked long hours and returned home carrying exhaustion like an invisible weight. Love existed, but it came in fragments, half-finished conversations, distracted nods, tired smiles that said more about survival than comfort. Sable learned early that need was inconvenient and vulnerability required timing. There was no space for breakdowns in a household where rent determined peace and calm was a form of currency. She adapted not by rebelling, but by observing. She watched how adults spoke differently when landlords were involved, how voices softened around authority and sharpened behind closed doors. She noticed how suffering was acknowledged only when it disrupted order. The neighborhood raised her as much as any person did. It taught her patterns before it taught her hope. Certain corners were avoided. Certain names were spoken carefully. Sirens, flashing lights, and late-night commotion blended into the rhythm of daily life. Pain happened often, but attention did not. Sable saw people hurt and forgotten in the same breath. What stayed with her most was not the violence itself, but how quickly the world moved on from it. The lesson settled quietly inside her. Pain alone was not enough to matter. School offered no refuge, only a different stage. Teachers praised resilience without asking what it cost. Struggle was treated as background noise, and excellence was rewarded only when it arrived neatly packaged. Sable realized that raw suffering made people uncomfortable, but curated struggle earned applause. She began to sense an invisible line between pain that repelled and pain that inspired. Somewhere between those two was a version of suffering that people could tolerate, even celebrate. That realization did not harden her. It sharpened her. She learned how to smile at the right moment, how to downplay fear, how to transform discomfort into composure. It was not deception, it was translation. She translated her reality into something others could digest. When she spoke about her life, she learned to smooth the sharpest edges. When she succeeded, she framed it as hope rather than escape. People responded better when her story made them feel generous instead of implicated. Each reaction taught her more than any lecture ever could. The first emotional seed took root when Sable noticed how attention worked. She watched a classmate cry publicly and be embraced, while another suffered quietly and remained invisible. She understood then that pain needed an audience to be validated. Private suffering was endured, but public suffering was acknowledged. This understanding did not make her crave attention, it made her respect its power. Attention could protect, it could redirect, it could rewrite how a story was received. She did not yet know what she would do with this knowledge, only that it felt necessary to survive. There was a moment, small in appearance, vast in consequence, that clarified everything for her. One afternoon, she witnessed an incident in her building that exposed the difference between what happened and what was seen. A conflict unfolded behind a door, muffled but unmistakable. Voices rose, something crashed, and then silence returned as if nothing had occurred. No one intervened. No one asked questions. Life continued. Later that same week, a far less severe incident happened in public, drawing crowds, concern, and authority. Sable understood then that suffering was not judged by severity, but by visibility. That incident lingered in her mind not as trauma but as instruction. She began to understand that stories determined outcomes. What people saw shaped what they cared about, and what they cared about shaped what changed. The realization did not make her angry. It made her focused. If the world responded to presentation, then presentation became a skill. If pain needed structure to be believed, then structure was not betrayal, it was strategy. Even as a child, Sable promised herself she would escape. Not in the dramatic sense, but in a measured, deliberate way. She would build a life where fear did not dictate her choices. But that promise came with an unspoken cost. Every step forward felt like a step away from people who could not leave. She worried that distance would become abandonment, that success would turn into separation. The idea of surviving while others remained trapped unsettled her. It was the first time she felt guilt about a future she had not yet earned. Still, she chose herself in quiet ways. She learned when to speak and when to stay silent. She learned how to turn discomfort into competence, how to convert chaos into calm. These were not acts of ambition, they were acts of preservation. Pain into content did not begin as a plan. It began as a shield. Each lesson she internalized helped her move through the world with fewer wounds, even if it meant hiding how deeply she was already marked. The choice that defined her early life came without ceremony. Faced with an opportunity to be honest and risk instability, or to stay composed and remain safe, Sable chose composure. It saved her in the moment. It kept her protected, praised, and unthreatening. But that decision planted something fragile inside her, a moral crack that widened slowly over time. It was the understanding that survival sometimes demanded silence, and silence, once learned, was difficult to unlearn. Kellen Rooks and Marquise Vale grew up in a place where expectation was a luxury and certainty was a threat. Their neighborhood did not announce danger loudly. It suggested it quietly, through patterns everyone learned to read. Doors closed early. Conversations stopped when unfamiliar cars slowed down. Survival depended less on strength and more on awareness. From the outside, the area looked neglected. From the inside, it functioned with its own rules, and breaking them carried consequences no one needed explained. Kellen learned those rules by watching. He was the kind of boy who noticed what people skipped over. He saw how promises were made publicly and broken privately, how authority changed its tone depending on who was listening. In school, he paid attention not just to lessons but to inconsistencies, what teachers corrected and what they ignored. In the streets, he observed how enforcement appeared suddenly and disappeared just as fast. His anger did not erupt, it settled. It organized itself into something deliberate. Injustice, to Kellen, was not shocking. It was repetitive, which made it unforgivable. Marquise learned differently. Where Kellen watched, Marquise performed. He understood early that presence could be power. His voice carried. His expressions drew attention. When he spoke, people listened, not because he demanded it, but because he made them feel something. Humor became his first defense. Confidence followed soon after. Attention, he discovered, could redirect danger, soften authority, and create room where none existed. If the world insisted on watching him, he decided he would control what it saw. Their bond formed not out of similarity but necessity. They filled the gaps in each other. Kellen grounded Marquise when impulse threatened to become recklessness. Marquise pulled Kellen forward when caution risked turning into paralysis. Together, they navigated a reality that seemed designed to limit them. They did not talk about dreams often. Dreams felt premature. What they talked about instead were patterns, why certain families were always targeted, why complaints disappeared, why consequences seemed selective. The first truth they uncovered did not arrive as revelation. It arrived as accumulation. Years of watching the same names resurface, the same outcomes repeat, the same explanations recycled. They saw how systems rewarded predictability and punished disruption. They noticed how some mistakes were forgiven instantly while others followed people for life. These were not theories. They were lived receipts, gathered through observation, memory, and shared experience. Their proof was not stored in files, it lived in timelines, faces, and outcomes that never changed. What set them apart was not just noticing these patterns, but what they did with them. When Kellen explained something, it was precise and unsettling. When Marquise shared it, people felt it immediately. Truth, in their hands, did not sit quietly. It spread. It provoked conversations people had learned to avoid. It made others uncomfortable in ways that demanded response. They did not set out to inspire anger, but anger followed naturally when clarity arrived. Lies burned when exposed, and the heat drew attention. They were not trying to be heroes. That distinction mattered to them. Heroism implied choice, and choice implied safety. What drove them was exhaustion. They were tired of feeling powerless in situations where outcomes were decided before anyone spoke. Tired of watching people comply not because they agreed, but because resistance seemed pointless. Their work, if it could be called that, was an attempt to reclaim agency, to prove to themselves that seeing the truth could still matter. As their efforts gained traction, so did the pressure. Attention brought risk. A misinterpreted detail, a misplaced word, or a single misstep could redefine them entirely. They understood how quickly labels formed and how rarely they were removed. Being young, black, and outspoken meant existing under constant evaluation. Every move felt like it could be the one that justified silencing them. The tension did not slow them down, but it sharpened their awareness. Precision became survival. The more they uncovered, the clearer it became that the system they were confronting was larger than their neighborhood. Patterns echoed outward, connecting local authority to broader structures of influence. Names appeared repeatedly, attached to initiatives that claimed progress while preserving control. The deeper they looked, the more familiar the architecture felt, as if it had been replicated across different lives, including ones far removed from their own. That was when they first heard the name spoken carefully, almost respectfully, like a warning disguised as admiration. Sable Granger. A symbol of success, resilience, and transcendence. Someone who had escaped the very conditions they were documenting. To many, she represented possibility. To Kellen and Marquis, she became a question. How did someone rise so far without confronting the system they had been shaped by? Or had she confronted it and chosen a different path? The realization unsettled them. Their work was no longer just about exposure, it was about collision. Whatever truth they were chasing did not exist in isolation. It intersected with stories people celebrated, stories that made struggle feel manageable. The boys sensed that their path was converging with forces far beyond their control, and as they followed, a new lead tied unmistakably to Sable Granger. They understood that the shadow they grew up under stretched further than they ever imagined. Sable Granger entered young adulthood with a skill most people never consciously develop. She knew how to shape attention. By the time she left her childhood behind, she had already learned that pain alone did not move the world, but meaning did. She carried her experiences carefully, not suppressing them, but refining them. What others processed emotionally, she processed strategically. Storytelling became her craft, not as confession, but as construction. Her early success did not come from exaggeration or deception. It came from restraint. Sable learned which parts of her history invited empathy and which parts provoked discomfort. She framed her trauma into lessons that sounded universal, her scars into motivation that felt accessible. Audiences responded because her story reassured them. It suggested that suffering could be endured without disruption, overcome without confrontation. Her vulnerability felt safe. It never demanded accountability from anyone else. What made Sable exceptional was not that she shared her pain, but that she curated it with precision. She understood the market for survival stories long before others named it. People wanted narratives that affirmed resilience without implicating systems. They wanted proof that success was possible without examining why failure was so common. Sable gave them exactly that, not out of malice, but out of understanding. She knew what sold because she knew what comforted. Each milestone reinforced the same lesson. The more she won, the more applause followed the versions of her story that required the least from others. Invitations increased. Platforms expanded. Her name became synonymous with perseverance. Yet with every achievement, something subtle shifted. She noticed that her worst nights, the ones that still unsettled her sleep, were now considered content assets. Pain that once demanded privacy was now evaluated for impact. Intimacy transformed quietly. What had once been shared in trust was now shared in structure. Grief became measurable. Healing became marketable. The boundaries between self and brand blurred until they were difficult to distinguish. Sable did not feel exploited. She felt efficient. But efficiency carried a cost she did not immediately name. Real sorrow resisted packaging. Certain memories refused to be softened without consequence. There was one incident she never fully spoke about. It sat at the core of her narrative, carefully avoided. Not because it was too painful, but because it was too revealing. That moment implicated someone powerful, someone whose name still opened doors. To share it would be to destabilize the architecture that supported her success. Silence, once again, proved useful. As her empire grew, so did the discipline required to maintain it. She surrounded herself with professionals who understood optics, timing, and influence. Every story was reviewed not for truth, but for risk. The machine that rewarded her resilience expected consistency. Deviations were discouraged politely, framed as protection. Sable told herself she was in control, that she was choosing what to share. And mostly she was. Yet beneath the success lingered an unease she could not monetize. The more she was praised, the more she sensed what was being rewarded was not her survival, but her compliance. She had learned how to turn pain into inspiration, but not how to turn it into change. That realization stayed dormant, waiting. The moment it stirred came quietly, through a private message that bypassed all filters. It contained a detail from her past she had never made public. A detail only one kind of person could know. Someone who had been there. The message did not threaten. It simply reminded her that some stories once uncovered could not be reshaped. Kellen Rooks and Marquise Vale approached truth the way others approached risk, deliberately and with respect for consequences. They did not rush to be seen. They built slowly, layering observation upon observation until patterns became undeniable. Their work was not about exposure for its own sake. It was about coherence, making sense of a reality that had been deliberately fragmented. They documented what they lived. Names resurfaced too often to be coincidence. Dates aligned with outcomes too neatly to be ignored. Consequences fell predictably on the same people. Their narrative was not sensational, it was consistent. And consistency over time built trust. People who had long felt unseen recognized themselves in the patterns Kellen and Marquise outlined. What began as quiet acknowledgement turned into cautious support. Their rise did not feel triumphant. It felt dangerous. With every connection made, they became more visible. Visibility brought scrutiny, and scrutiny brought vulnerability. They were no longer just observers, they were participants in a story others wanted to control. The work exposed them as much as it empowered them. Each step forward narrowed their margin for error. A local figure, respected publicly and insulated by reputation, began to feel the pressure. Influence did not like being examined. Concerns surfaced disguised as advice. Warnings arrived framed as protection. The message was clear without being stated. Certain narratives were tolerated only if they remained incomplete. As attention grew, their story began appearing in unexpected places. Circles that celebrated polished resilience took notice. The same audiences consuming Sable Granger's carefully framed survival story encountered the boys' raw accounting of systemic failure. The contrast was striking. Where Sable's brand made pain watchable, Kellen and Marquise made pain unavoidable. This overlap was not accidental. It signaled convergence. The boys realized that their work was brushing against a larger ecosystem of influence, one that preferred inspiration over interrogation. Their truth disrupted a balance many relied on. That disruption attracted interest, not all of it supportive. The warning came from someone unexpected, someone close enough to power to recognize danger. It was not framed as a threat, but as concern. The boys were told they were stepping onto ground that looked solid but concealed something volatile. The name attached to that warning carried weight. Sable Granger. Sable Granger did not learn about Kellen Rooks and Marquise Vale through headlines or public noise. She learned about them the way she learned about anything that mattered, quietly, through briefings, summaries, and carefully worded observations passed along by people paid to notice risk before it became visible. Their names appeared first as a footnote in a report about emerging narratives that were gaining traction outside traditional channels. At first, they seemed minor. Then their consistency stood out. Then their influence. To Sable, they registered simultaneously as a problem and an opportunity. A problem because their work disrupted the balance her empire depended on. An opportunity because disruption, when redirected correctly, could be absorbed, reframed, and even monetized. She did not react emotionally. She analyzed. She examined what they represented, what they threatened, and what they might become if left unchecked or guided strategically. To her, people were not fixed entities, they were variables. She studied their rise the way she studied markets, noticing patterns, identifying leverage points, assessing volatility. Kellen's precision made him dangerous. Marquise's magnetism made him unpredictable. Together, they formed something that could not be easily dismissed or co-opted. Their truth did not arrive as accusation, it arrived as accumulation. That was harder to refute, harder to soften, harder to ignore. Meanwhile, Kellen and Marquise studied Sable from a distance that felt deliberate. She was everywhere and nowhere at once. A symbol held up as proof that escape was possible. To many, she represented triumph. To them, she represented a question. They examined her story not for inspiration, but for omission. They noticed what she emphasized and what she avoided. Her success unsettled them not because it existed, but because of what it did not confront. Admiration came first. They respected what she had built. They understood the discipline it required, but admiration does not survive unanswered questions. Slowly, suspicion crept in. They wondered how someone could rise so far without colliding with the same resistance they faced daily. Or perhaps she had collided and chosen to negotiate instead of confront. That possibility troubled them more than open opposition would have. The first shared thread surfaced unexpectedly. An old incident from Sable's childhood, one she had never publicly detailed, appeared in the boys' broader investigation into systemic patterns. At first, it seemed coincidental. Then the names aligned. Then the timing. The incident was not isolated. It was part of a structure the boys were already exposing. For Sable, the realization felt like a tightening room. For the boys, it felt like confirmation. Influence responded as it always did, quietly and efficiently. Invitations were extended. Conversations framed as collaboration surfaced. Deals were suggested without being formalized. Pressure arrived wrapped in politeness. Careers were not threatened directly. Alternatives were simply withdrawn. The message was consistent across all channels. Alignment brought safety. Deviation brought isolation. Sable felt the machine activate around her. She recognized its language because she had benefited from it. The difference now was proximity. The boy's work was forcing the system to protect itself, and she was positioned as both shield and asset. Her silence became strategic again, not because she agreed, but because she understood the consequences of speaking out of turn. Kellen and Marquise sensed the same mechanisms closing in. They noticed access narrowing, responses slowing, familiar support becoming conditional. The truth, they realized, demanded payment. What they disagreed on with Sable was who should bear that cost. To her, survival had always required compromise. To them, compromise felt like erasure. The meeting that mattered never happened in person. It happened through data points, reactions, and shifts in behavior. It happened in the way doors opened for Sable and closed for them. It happened in the sudden interest certain people took in redirecting their narrative. Each side recognized the other as intelligent, strategic, and dangerous in different ways. The tension peaked when Sable discovered the boys possessed a piece of evidence she had never accounted for. Not a rumor or interpretation, but something concrete, something that connected her untold past to the system she had learned to navigate. The evidence did not just threaten her empire. It threatened the story she told herself about control. The deeper Kellen Rooks and Marquise Vale pushed into their investigation, the more the world around them seemed to widen and narrow at the same time. On the surface, everything expanded: philanthropic foundations, media partnerships, nonprofit initiatives, glossy campaigns promising empowerment and progress. Beneath that surface, however, the space to move shrank. The same names appeared repeatedly, connected through boards, sponsorships, and advisory roles that blurred the line between generosity and control. What looked like goodwill functioned more like insulation. This was the machine behind the mirror. It did not operate through force or overt suppression. It worked through framing. Stories were allowed, even encouraged, as long as they remained individualized. Pain could be shared if it was inspirational, neatly resolved, and disconnected from systemic responsibility. Trauma was welcome when it proved resilience, not when it demanded reform. The moment suffering pointed outward, toward structures, incentives, or specific names, it became dangerous. Sable Granger existed uncomfortably close to this mechanism. Her success was not manufactured, but it had been amplified by the machine's preference for safe narratives. She had been elevated as an example of triumph without disruption, proof that the system could work if individuals worked hard enough. That framing protected sponsors, reassured audiences, and preserved existing power. Sable understood this intellectually, but acknowledging it emotionally threatened the foundation she stood on. She was not a villain in this architecture. She was a survivor who had learned, early and accurately, what kind of truth the world rewarded. The machine did not coerce her, it applauded her. It reinforced her instincts to soften, to curate, to withhold. Every partnership she accepted came with expectations that were rarely spoken but always understood. Stay inspirational. Stay forward-looking. Stay unthreatening. For Kellen and Marquise, the realization was sobering. They were not confronting a single antagonist, but a network that fed itself through silence and selective storytelling. Resistance did not come as confrontation, it came as disappearance. Calls went unanswered. Messages were left unread. Sources who once spoke freely suddenly remembered obligations elsewhere. Doors that had been opened closed without explanation. The cinematic tension escalated quietly. Their phones went silent at the same time. Access narrowed in coordinated ways that suggested intent rather than coincidence. The absence of reaction became its own message. The machine did not need to argue with them. It simply withdrew oxygen. As they mapped connections, a pattern emerged that unsettled them deeply. The central node of influence, the place where narratives were shaped and redirected, appeared alarmingly close to Sable's inner circle. Someone who had access. Someone who understood both sides. Someone positioned to manage risk from within. The realization reframed everything they thought they knew about proximity, power, and protection. The evidence Kellen and Marquise assembled no longer resembled a scandal. It was too consistent, too interconnected. What they held was a pattern that spanned years and reputations. Local power brokers appeared alongside public figures celebrated for their community involvement. Initiatives praised for impact revealed gaps where accountability should have been. At the center of it all was a story Sable Granger had never fully told. Not because it weakened her narrative, but because it exposed how survival had been negotiated. The implication was devastating in its clarity. Sable's brand had been built on selective truth, and that selectivity had been rewarded at every stage. The full truth did not just threaten her image, it threatened the sense of safety she had constructed around herself. The empire she built was not merely financial. It was psychological. It protected her from revisiting moments she had learned to frame away. Inside Sable, a quiet battle intensified. She had always believed control meant choice. Now she questioned whether her choices had been shaped by invisible boundaries she never challenged. Protecting the empire meant preserving the version of herself the world applauded. Protecting the truth meant dismantling the architecture that kept her insulated. Both options carried loss. Only one carried consequence beyond herself. For the boys, the conflict was no less severe. Publishing now meant retaliation they were not fully equipped to absorb. Waiting risked losing momentum, credibility, and safety. The longer they held the evidence, the heavier it felt. Truth demanded timing, but timing was never neutral. Every delay benefited someone else. Pressure mounted from all sides. Sable felt it in tightened conversations and strategic silences. Kellen and Marquise felt it in the narrowing of options. The machine sensed destabilization and responded by closing ranks. Each party understood they were being forced toward a decision that would redefine what success meant, not as visibility or wealth, but as responsibility. The breaking point arrived quietly. The night before the evidence was scheduled to go public, a critical piece vanished. Not through chaos or accident, but with precision that suggested access and reach. The disappearance did not erase the truth. It clarified the stakes. The trail pointed unmistakably toward someone with billionaire-level influence, and the realization confirmed what none of them could deny anymore. The fight was no longer about exposure. It was about who controlled the story when everything familiar began to collapse. The cost of truth arrived for Kellen Rooks and Marquise Vale not as a single blow, but as a slow tightening around their lives. It began with a shift in atmosphere. Conversations ended abruptly when they entered rooms. Familiar routines attracted unfamiliar attention. Bureaucratic processes that once moved slowly suddenly accelerated in inconvenient directions. Nothing was explicit, yet everything felt intentional. The pressure was designed to be deniable. They noticed the surveillance first, not through devices but through behavior. Repeated questions from different offices asking for the same information. Requests for clarification that had already been provided. The sense of being tracked not physically, but administratively. Intimidation hid behind procedure. Authority presented itself as concern. The message was subtle, but consistent visibility had consequences. Alongside this came the smears. Not accusations strong enough to require defense, but insinuations designed to erode trust. Their motivations were questioned. Their credibility was reframed as ambition. The truth they carried was no longer debated. It was dismissed as opportunism. The messiness of lived experience was weaponized against them. Complexity became a liability. Sable Granger felt a parallel unraveling from a different vantage point. Her phone did not stop ringing. Sponsors called not to accuse, but to express discomfort. Brand partners spoke in the language of alignment and values, hinting that association had become risky. The same machine that once amplified her resilience now evaluated her as expendable. She recognized the shift immediately. Praise was conditional. Loyalty was temporary. What unsettled her most was not the threat to her empire, but the speed with which admiration turned transactional. The machine did not protect people, it protected narratives. And narratives could be replaced. The realization triggered an old fear she thought she had outgrown, the fear of becoming invisible again, not because she lacked value, but because she no longer fit the frame. Emotionally, everyone was isolated. Kellen and Marquise felt exposed, watched, and misrepresented. Sable felt surrounded and unseen. The public watched everything unfold with interest, consuming updates as entertainment rather than consequence. Attention did not translate into understanding. Visibility did not guarantee protection. The escalation came through a staged leak that appeared seamlessly online. It was polished, coherent, and emotionally satisfying in all the wrong ways. The boys were reframed as opportunists exploiting community pain for personal gain. Sable was positioned as a victim of jealous critics unable to accept her success. The narrative resolved tension neatly, assigning roles audiences could recognize and digest. The lie spread faster because it required less effort. It was simple, flattering, and reassuring. The truth, by contrast, was complex, uncomfortable, and unresolved. It demanded patience and moral engagement. In the economy of attention, the lie was efficient. Sable recognized the maneuver immediately. Her image was being used as a shield, absorbing criticism and redirecting blame. The boys recognized something equally unsettling. Public opinion was not organic, it was engineered. Both realizations arrived with clarity and dread. The night ended with a decision. Marquis, feeling the walls close in, chose escalation over endurance. He prepared to force the truth forward in a way that bypassed filters and intermediaries. It was a move that could not be undone. One that could cost him everything he had left to protect. Sable Granger faced the ultimatum in private, where such decisions were always made. It was never framed as a threat. It arrived as a reminder of mutual benefit. Stay aligned, maintain consistency, preserve access. Step out of line, and the safety net would dissolve. The message was clear without being spoken. Her empire existed within boundaries she did not control. The emotional weight of the moment pulled her backward in time. She remembered being a child who wanted the world to notice her pain. Now the world watched her constantly, scrutinizing every move, and still did not see her. Visibility had not delivered understanding. It had only changed the terms of judgment. Her strategic mind engaged instinctively. Sable began mapping scenarios, contingencies, and exits. She looked for ways to expose the machine without sacrificing Kellen and Marquis. She understood leverage, timing, and narrative flow. But strategy required trust, and trust was in short supply. The boys did not trust her. They had reasons grounded in experience. She represented a system that had rewarded silence. Her proximity to power made her suspect by default. Every move she made could be interpreted as self-preservation. She accepted that skepticism as earned. Suspicion deepened when Sable discovered a breach within her inner circle. Information she had kept tightly controlled had been moving outward. Someone close had been feeding the network details, shaping responses before she could act. The betrayal was not shocking. It was clarifying. Trust became the rarest currency. No one could afford to spend it freely. Every alliance carried risk. Every delay had consequences. Sable realized that neutrality was no longer possible. The machine demanded alignment and resistance demanded sacrifice. When she identified the traitor, the recognition cut deeper than professional loss. The person was tied to her earliest wound, a connection she had never fully confronted. The betrayal collapsed past and present into a single moment of reckoning. It forced her to confront not just what she might lose, but who she had been protecting all along. The reckoning did not arrive as a speech, a press conference, or a dramatic declaration. It arrived as structure. An orchestrated release unfolded across platforms with precision that left little room for interpretation. Receipts appeared in sequence, timelines aligned cleanly, and patterns emerged that could not be dismissed as coincidence. The material did not argue, it demonstrated. It invited scrutiny rather than applause, and that distinction changed everything. Kellen Rooks and Marquis Vale had learned that truth gained power when it was organized. What they released was not framed as outrage but as record. Names appeared alongside dates, outcomes, and institutional responses. The story no longer belonged to any single voice. It belonged to evidence. Once visible, the connections were impossible to unsee. What had been fragmented into isolated incidents revealed itself as a system with memory and intent. The impact was immediate and volatile. People mobilized not because they were instructed to, but because recognition activated them. Institutions scrambled to respond, issuing statements that acknowledged concern without addressing cause. Sponsors panicked, reassessing associations that had once felt safe. The machine that thrived on predictability faced disruption it had not anticipated. The boys' truth into fire trait manifested not as spectacle, but as momentum. Yet as attention surged, so did distortion. The public hunger for drama threatened to eclipse the human reality beneath the data. Narratives began forming faster than facts could be absorbed. Some treated the exposure as entertainment, others as confirmation of beliefs they already held. The risk was clear: complexity would be flattened, and the people at the center would be reduced to symbols rather than lives. Sable Granger stepped into the open at the most dangerous moment. She did not offer inspiration. She did not speak in metaphors of resilience. She reframed her pain as evidence, aligning her untold past with the patterns now visible. It was a shift that destabilized her entire identity. The story that had protected her for years no longer served its purpose. In exposing what she had once curated away, she placed herself outside the frame that made her valuable to the machine. The retaliation was swift and sophisticated. Legal mechanisms activated quietly. Character assassination tactics surfaced under the guise of accountability. Questions were raised about credibility, intent, and association. The machine did not deny the facts, it reframed the people presenting them. Responsibility was diffused, redirected, delayed. The goal was not to win the argument, but to exhaust the opposition. As victories accumulated, so did danger. Each confirmation triggered a countermeasure. Each acknowledgement exposed another vulnerability. Kellen and Marquise understood that progress did not equal safety. The closer they came to validation, the more incentive there was to destabilize them. Sable felt the same escalation from a different angle. The applause she lost was replaced by scrutiny that carried real consequence. The reckoning revealed a paradox neither side could ignore. Truth could move institutions, but it could also fracture alliances. Pressure exposed fault lines that had been invisible under silence. The more undeniable the pattern became, the more personal the attacks grew. It was no longer about what was proven. It was about who could withstand the aftermath. Just as it appeared the truth had secured its place, a counterstrike landed with calculated timing. Details from the boys' past surfaced selectively, stripped of context and arranged to provoke doubt. The intent was clear: divide them, isolate them, force internal conflict where external pressure had failed. The attack did not dispute the evidence. It questioned the messengers. The threat was not exposure, but erosion. If Kellen and Marquise turned on each other, the story would collapse under its own weight. And as the narrative began to strain under the pressure, it became clear that the reckoning was only the beginning. The fallout did not arrive all at once. It unfolded in waves, each one stripping away something that had once felt stable. Deals collapsed quietly, not with confrontation but with absence. Calls stopped coming. Agreements dissolved into vague statements about timing and alignment. Friendships fractured under the weight of unspoken fear, as people recalculated proximity and risk. Safety, once assumed, became conditional. Every environment felt temporary, every connection tentative. What unsettled everyone most was how little relief victory brought. The exposure had worked. The patterns were acknowledged. Yet winning did not feel like winning. It felt like standing in the aftermath of something irreversible. Innocence had been lost long before, but now peace followed it. The ability to trust, once stretched thin, was reduced to careful calculation. Progress came with a constant question: what would it cost next? Sable Granger felt the emptiness sharply. The platform she once commanded now felt hollow. Content, she realized, could never replace community. Applause could not substitute for accountability. Wealth could not purchase a clean conscience. For years, she had believed that control equaled safety. Now she understood that safety built on silence eventually demanded payment, and payment always came with interest. She began using her resources differently, not to restore her image, but to protect people who had never been insulated to begin with. She redirected attention away from spectacle and towards structure. Legal support replaced branding. Quiet funding replaced public gestures. She did not announce these shifts, she acted. Redemption, she learned, did not need to be visible to be real. Kellen Rooks and Marquise Vale faced their own reckoning. Carrying truth without infrastructure had nearly destroyed them. They learned that truth, when held alone, could burn the person holding it. Exposure without support was not bravery. It was vulnerability without shelter. They began building something steadier, networks rooted in shared responsibility rather than individual risk. Their work slowed, but it deepened. The connection between Sable and the boys remained imperfect. Trust did not return fully. It was rebuilt in fragments, through consistency rather than promises. They did not become symbols of unity. They became collaborators bound by consequence. Each understood that alignment did not require intimacy. It required integrity. Healing did not arrive as a moment. It arrived as a reordering. Priorities shifted. Visibility lost its appeal. Impact replaced influence as the measure that mattered. The story moved forward not because it was trending, but because it was necessary. Accountability replaced inspiration. Substance replaced performance. Just as the dust began to settle, a final document surfaced quietly. It did not contradict what had been exposed. It expanded it. The machine they had fought was revealed as only one branch of something larger, more entrenched, and more patient. The implications were sobering. The battle they survived had been an introduction, not a conclusion. The realization did not bring panic. It brought clarity. What they had done could not be undone. What came next would demand even more restraint, coordination, and resolve. Redemption had scars, and those scars carried memory. As they prepared for what lay ahead, one truth remained unmistakable. The fight for meaning had only just begun. What emerged after the collapse did not resemble victory in any conventional sense. There was no unified front, no symbolic alliance stage for reassurance. Sable Granger, Kellen Rooks, and Marquise Vale did not become a perfect team, and none of them tried to pretend otherwise. What they built was quieter and more durable than image. They became aligned not by affection or agreement, but by purpose shaped through loss. Distance remained between them, but it was no longer charged with suspicion. It was functional. Each understood the limits of the others, and more importantly, the limits of themselves. Alignment did not require constant proximity. It required clarity. They shared an understanding that the truth they carried could not survive ego, speed, or spectacle. It needed patience and structure, or it would collapse under its own weight. Sable's transformation was the most visible, but not the loudest. She stopped selling pain as inspiration. The language of triumph and resilience quietly disappeared from her platforms. In its place came analysis, context, and records that demanded engagement rather than admiration. Her audience shrank, predictably. Profit followed. But what remained was different. The people who stayed were no longer looking to feel good about survival. They were looking to understand the conditions that made survival necessary. Using her platform differently required restraint she had never practiced before. She resisted the urge to personalize every issue. She allowed discomfort to linger without resolution. She pointed outward instead of inward, toward structures, incentives, and accountability. The machine that once amplified her withdrew its interest. In that withdrawal, she found an unfamiliar sense of relief. For the first time, her relevance was no longer tied to her wounds. Kellen and Marquise changed more internally than publicly. Their fire did not extinguish, but it learned direction. They understood now that truth without discipline was unsustainable. They slowed their pace deliberately, prioritizing networks over moments. Leadership replaced urgency. They created systems that distributed risk instead of concentrating it. The work became less about exposure and more about endurance. They learned how to hold truth without letting it consume them. Boundaries formed where none had existed. Rest became strategy. Silence, once imposed, became chosen. The anger that once fueled everything was refined into resolve. They no longer needed to be everywhere at once. They needed to be precise. The relationship between Sable and the boys settled into something unremarkable and therefore rare. No declarations of unity, no symbolic gestures. Just coordinated decisions, shared information, and mutual respect earned through consistency. They did not trust each other completely, and they did not need to. What mattered was that they trusted the work. The story they had lived proved something none of them could ignore anymore. Survival was not the same as freedom. Survival kept you alive. Freedom demanded shared risk. It required people to step outside the roles assigned to them and accept consequences that could not be framed as inspiration. Freedom did not guarantee safety. It guaranteed responsibility. Not every villain fell. Some names remained untouched. Some losses were permanent. Careers did not recover. Relationships did not repair. The machine adapted, as it always had. But something irreversible had shifted. Power was no longer confronted as myth. It was confronted as process. The language around it changed. The silence around it weakened. Others were watching. Younger voices, quieter at first, began asking different questions. They did not treat truth as a trend or exposure as entertainment. They approached it as obligation. What they saw in Sable, Kellen, and Marquise was not perfection but consequence. They learned that speaking carried cost, and that cost could be shared. Just as the story seemed to reach a natural resting point, a signal arrived from an unexpected place. It was subtle, almost easy to dismiss. A reference that did not fit locally. A pattern that suggested coordination beyond anything they had faced before. The implication was unmistakable. What they had uncovered was not isolated. It connected upward, outward, and across borders of influence. The realization did not provoke fear. It provoked a preparation. They understood now what kind of war truth required. Not volume, but endurance. Not spectacle, but alignment. As the next chapter began to form, one truth anchored them all: what they built from the ashes could not be undone, and whatever came next would demand even more than they had already given. This story didn't ask to be watched casually. It asked to be carried forward. If any part of it stayed with you, don't let it end here. Pass it on to someone who needs to sit with it too. Staying connected to stories like this is how truth survives longer than silence. And before you leave, consider this: if telling the truth cost you safety, comfort, or the life you worked hard to build, would you still choose to speak, or would you protect what you've earned? Write your answer below.